Barney Frank, we welcome you back to Sixth and I and to Politics and Prose for speaking frankly. Your first book and the biography of you, called Barney Frank, you were wise to suggest that Dodd-Frank be Dodd-Frank, otherwise everyone would think Dodd's name was Frank. Carla and I first met Barney over 50 years ago, and since that time we've worked on many good causes together. With Barney Frank, you've got a public person who values service, who values politics, who values organizing, who embraces ideas and believes in an activist government and knows the difference between and the importance of freedom from and freedom for in his fight for the LGBT community and civil rights and civil liberties, and a person whose eyes do not glaze over when we talk about affordable housing or other parts of the social safety net. He does it with wit. It's a wit that we all envy and that we enjoy in its saber-like qualities. Now, there's a lot of shouting in Washington, so tonight we're doing something different, and that's why there's going to be a conversation between Barney Frank and Albert Hunt. And we welcome you, Al Hunt, to Sixth and I and Politics and Prose. Al Hunt is a respected columnist for the Bloomberg View, and he's which is part of Bloomberg News, and you've all seen him on TV in his own program, Political Capital, and with Mark Shields, and he does Charlie Rose regularly, and there'll be more of that, I gather. So let us welcome Barney Frank and Al Hunt for a conversation to Sixth and I in Politics and Prose.
I'm not Barney Frank, but I am delighted to be here with Barney Frank. I first met Barney Frank. I'm not quite the veteran that David Cohen is. Mine is only 47 years. 1968, I promised, a kid reporter in Boston, at least I thought I was, and I would walk home at night from our offices at Wall Street Journal down in Post Office Square to an apartment house I lived in on the Common, and I'd go through this little alley. And the alley, there was a famous restaurant, Lockover's Restaurant, and there was a men's bar and dining area downstairs. This is 1968. Women were allowed in there twice a year, or one and a half times, New Year's Eve and when the Harvard-Yale game was played in Cambridge. But when I would walk by many nights, I would see sitting this solo figure at a table with about 187 papers and at least 2 huge slabs of beef, and totally immersed in those papers. And that was 27-year-old, I guess, or 28-year-old Barney Frank, because he was running the city of Boston. He was Kevin White's top aide, and he really was running the city of Boston. And he came to our Bloomberg Bureau whatever it was, 40 years later, when he was chairman of the banking committee, or financial services committee, and he said, now that I have power. And I said, I knew you when you had power, you were running the city of Boston. He said, I didn't know I had power then, I know I have power now. So this is a fabulous book, and anyone who hasn't read it ought to read it. My only complaint is I actually interviewed Barney earlier today for Charlie Rose, and I read every single page. And I thought, boy, I am conscientious. So what's the first thing he said to me? What did you think of the appendices? So when you read it, read the appendices, please. Barney, it's really in many ways it's a fascinating book, and it's a tale of 2 stories. One, the story about your career in politics and public service, and the other about your sexual orientation. And the way the first, as you put it, I think so well, when you first got into politics in the 60s, it was easy to be a progressive or a liberal, or at least there was a wave and you couldn't even talk about. You couldn't even acknowledge that you were gay. And here we are now, 40 years later, and you can, easily, the whole political issue of gays have changed so much, but liberals seem to be in the dissent. So talk about that dichotomy, and then we'll talk about each one for a while.
I wanted to get into politics because I had strong views about the way I'd like to change the world. One of the things that got me started, I was 14, was the brutal murder of Emmett Till, and the revelation that law enforcement in Mississippi had killed this black kid who was my age because he looked at a white woman wrong, and nobody was going to do anything about it. And I said, gee, well, shouldn't the federal government be there? The answer was no, because Southerners and filibusters have kept that from happening. At the same time, I was fascinated by television. My father was an early adopter. He bought a television set literally in 1940. There weren't many programs, and one of the things I was influenced by was the hearings between the Army McCarthy hearings, the investigation into McCarthy's bullying of the Army. And that also, here was this guy who I knew enough to feel was a terribly negative force. And both of those made me think, boy, that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to be involved here. And frankly, the Army McCarthy hearings had an impact because I had learned early on, when I was 14, that I was pretty good verbally, that I had a kind of flair for debating and things. And here were these guys debating these issues. So I thought, I could do that. That would be pretty good. And at the same time, I knew I was gay. I'd made that, my aha moment that I was gay had come just before that. I know it was Ben Carson, the new Republican hope, announcing that it was a choice. I suppose I should make clear that at 13, I did not say, you know what, I think I will be hated. I think I'll achieve every teenager's dream and join this group that everybody holds in contempt, including me even a little bit, because self-hate was one of our problems. And I said, here's the problem. I want to be influential in changing the world. And government's a place to do that, but I'll never get there. As I said, 60 years later, things have changed. Being gay is no longer a barrier to being influential in government, but the problem is that government is no longer influential in society. So I am now a much more important person in a much less important institution, and what I would like to do is to change that. As I said, the pace, we're finally there. It's been moving and moving, but even like 15 years ago, if I'd said to someone, you know what, in my last year in Congress, as a member of Congress, I'm going to marry Jim, who's sitting there in the front row, and people would have said, well, you sure, that's going to be pretty controversial if you were to do that. Well, it turned out our marriage in my last year in Congress did generate a lot of controversy among my colleagues. Many of them were very angry that we didn't invite them. We didn't have room. I'm sure it was not rude.
Barney, you describe and acknowledge the emotional, the wrenching emotional experience you went through when you got in politics with Kevin and then later in the General Court in Congress, not being able to be open about the fact you were gay.
Yeah, I sort of convinced myself of, I think, a great myth, namely that you can have a very successful career, and if it's sufficiently successful, you will derive from that career enough satisfaction so that you don't need a private life, that you can just live as a public person and be honored and feel good about that, and you can not have a private life. And I think not only is it the case that no career is a substitute for the kind of emotional, physical needs that a healthy human being has, but in some ways it makes it worse. There's this old song like Saturday night is the loneliest night in the week. The contrast between a very successful public career and a bleak personal life makes it worse. And in particular, I made the decision when I ran first in 1972, and I made the decision that I would, I couldn't be honest about being gay, but it would be unworthy not to be a supporter of gay rights. So I said, okay, I'll be a coward, but I won't be a hypocrite. And actually, so that began a situation where I was working with the gay and lesbian movement. It was just starting, but it was very active. And there would be combined events, political, that would become social. And I would be there for the political part. And then when it became social, I'd go home. And the contrast struck me. Here I basically said, this is nuts. I'm fighting very hard for these rights and then denying myself voluntarily the chance to enjoy them. And that's what really began me thinking that I had to end that and come out.
Did it ever even occur to you that the people you work with, the Kevin Whites, the Michael Harringtons, the David Bartleys, and the people in Congress, that there was any sense that was an issue, or was it just totally?
I don't think they suspected it of me. For one thing, when I'm under stress, I eat. I suppose it's appropriate in the synagogue to say that I once explained, the Washington Post asked me why I gained weight during the campaign when most people lost weight, and I will translate briefly, some will need the translation. I said I can sum that up in 2 words: stress, fress. Fress being the Yiddish word for overeating. And Frank, I just didn't look like people's stereotype of a gay man. Look, I got the fact is that schlumpy gay men was not what people thought about. That's what I say I've tried to change. Jim helps me with that. I'm wearing a very nice suit, which, by the way, is made by members of the union in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The union suit. You want to buy a union suit? Joseph Abboud suits. But in fact, I knew that they didn't think that of me because I overheard. Well, I don't know if I ever told you this, Al. Kevin White was a very liberal guy by those standards. He was. He turned around the racist politics of Boston, and they had a very good friend named Bob Crane, who, on the surface, was a happy-go-lucky pal, but cared enough about this to support Kevin. And I heard them one night talking. The 2 of them, I was with them, the 3 of us were maybe at dinner, and they had just seen Truman Capote on one of the late night shows. I might have been Jack Parr. And one of them said to the other, there's a little bit of political envy there. Hey, I just saw Jack Kennedy's great friend, Truman Capote. He's a screaming fag. Now, that was, they weren't particularly bigoted. That's what everybody thought about that time. Right. So it does strike me that they would not have talked about Capote being such a screaming fag if they thought that I was gay.
We're jumping ahead, but tell everybody the story about the call you got from Alan Simpson when you did,
Alan Simpson's a wonderful, genuine, decent man who was essentially driven out of elective politics on the Republican side. He'd been the Republican whip, and he lost it to Trent Lott, and then he was going to have a tough primary challenge because he was pro-choice and supportive of gay rights. But he and I had worked very closely together on immigration and a couple other issues. And the day after I came out, I was back down in D.C. or after the weekend, and he called me, and he said, Barney, it's Alan, I want to apologize. I said, for what? He said, well, knowing me and knowing my approach to life, I am sure I've made some anti-gay jokes in your presence. He said, I make anti-everything jokes, and I just want to tell you how much I respect you. And there was a similar one that I think I mentioned. Warren Rudman was another of that extinct species, the reasonable Republican, who I'd worked with Warren, who'd been the Attorney General of New Hampshire, to protect the Legal Services Corporation from Ed Meese early in the Reagan administration. And I was in Rollins, the convenience store that members here will know on 4th and Pennsylvania. And those who have these, those who watch House of Cards and think it has some remote resemblance to reality, which of course it does not, would be surprised at any given evening about 10, 11 o'clock or 9, 10 o'clock to see half a dozen members of Congress doing their shopping in Rollins. And I walked in there shortly after that, and Warren Rudman was there. And I said hello and walked to the back of the store. And Rudman waited until I was at the back of the store, and he was at the front door so everybody could hear him. And he said, Barney, my friend, I'm proud of you. And so those are things, obviously, that were very, very supportive to me when time when I thought I needed it.
Barney, if the Supreme Court, as many expect it will, says that same-sex marriage is constitutionally protected, is that you told me earlier that there were still some politicians, particularly Republicans, who won't acknowledge their sexual orientation. Would a court decision change the dynamics of that, and would it really put an end to that issue, and what would then be the next
No,
phase?
I mean, it's going to be very important. There still will be a need for us to get legislation passed that protects people in most states, although not in the largest population states, from being fired or otherwise discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that one, by the way, that's the kind of right, the right not to be discriminated against by private employers, which constitutionally cannot be a court mandate. The court can protect you against government action, but that has to come from positive legislative work. I obviously very much want to see that opinion. I want to see that opinion for two reasons, declaring that marriage is a right. First of all, it's a very important right to be recognized for people all over the country. And secondly, I just look forward to seeing just how vitriolically homophobic Antonin Scalia can get when his colleagues declare. I mean, that one I think should be put in the movies when he starts fulminating. But we will still have to. But here is this problem. In 1976, Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford were about the same place on LGBT rights, both beginning to get favorable. And then there were three trend lines since then in America. The country as a whole has gotten steadily more supportive of equal treatment. The Democrats have gotten supportive at a higher rate, and the Republicans have gotten worse. And sadly, it is now a problem. The Republicans understand that bigotry is not popular. So that, the best example of that, the governor of Pennsylvania, ex-governor, Republican, when a federal court says we can have marriage, he announces, I am not appealing that decision. And he's honest about why. He said, I'm not for same-sex marriage. I don't want that to be an issue in this election. Here's where we are with the Republicans. Most Republicans understand today that being gay and lesbian is not a choice. I mean, Carson is just a cultural laggard. But they still think it's not a nice thing. And I'm telling you this is from observation. If you are a gay Republican, I don't say gay or lesbian because there's almost no lesbian Republicans. You got to really be. A gay Republican is enough of a stretch, but a lesbian Republican is really very rare. Most of the Republicans are men, the gay ones. And here's the problem. If you are a Republican in politics and you are gay, they will accept the fact that you couldn't help it, but they don't want you to seem very happy about it. I'm serious. So Republicans who are in elected office and who come out don't stay very long, whereas Democrats are very, very much supported by the party. So no, I think that's going to take another generation to change.
Barney, you write in the book that Democrats, at least a lot of Democrats, who think that the notion of progressive, effective government is in a decline, they're wrong. They ought to appreciate, I guess it was the James Carville maxim, it's the economy, stupid. What agenda would you like to see your party pursue, this year, even in the face of a Republican Congress, but particularly after 16?
Well, primarily on the affirmative side, there's a cleanup on LGBT rights, and there are still racism problems. But the main thing we should do, and this deals with race as well, but it's a twofer in that sense, is to develop a specific agenda and push for it to diminish economic inequality. That is the greatest problem in America today. And it incorporates the race problem, because as long as you have racial discrimination, the victims of that are going to be the worst off economically. And it's a twofold problem. I want us to diminish inequality first because we ought to diminish it. It's unhealthy. And by the way, it's also bad for the economy. Consumption is the major economic activity. And economists now agree. If consumption is depressed because average people don't have enough money to buy things, then you are going to have a slower growth rate. But there's another reason connected to this. If we can diminish inequality in ways that are tangible, we begin to turn around the anti-government attitude. Look, some people are anti-government because they are philosophically opposed to government. Some people who are very wealthy are opposed to government because they think the government's coming after their money. That's a sensible reaction for them, a selfish one. There are people who don't want environmental policies to be very aggressive because it will interfere with their business methods. What frustrates me is the segment of this society that consists of people who 80 years ago would have been big supporters of FDR, and then later of Harry Truman, of John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. These are white working class men, middle class men, people who do sort of physical work, who are angry because their economic position has eroded. Because beginning in the 70s, you know, we had this great period after World War II when America was, we could make anything and sell it to the world. Beginning literally in the 70s with very little change, Clinton slowed it down just a little bit with his tax bill, the relative economic position of the great majority of men who work with their hands, who don't have advanced degrees, who don't have all these skills, who have only their own willingness to work to offer and basic intelligence, their economic position is eroded. And these are people, they've become critical of government now, not because they are philosophically opposed to government, but because they believe deeply that government is powerful. And they take the failure of government to help them as a sign that the people running the government don't like them. That is, these are people who think the government could do something. Why don't we do what FDR did? So the most important thing we can do is to deal with things that bring down economic inequality, lessen the strain on these people, give them a greater share of prosperity, not only because that's a good thing in itself morally, because it helps the economy, but also because it is the key to breaking this anti-government cycle. And look, when Thomas Frank, no relation, wrote the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, I tended to agree with the analysis. I now think we made a mistake. It is not God, guns, and gays that has white working class people vote against us. Guns are a problem. God and gays, no. That has not been an issue. Even abortion. I don't know many Democrats who lost because of abortion. But the problem is, I think, the economy. That it is the perception on the part of a lot of people whose economic position is eroded that the government hasn't helped them. And the social issues come on only to this extent. Some of them believe that we are helping black people and gay people and women, and that's why they're not getting help. I don't think that's accurate in terms of their position. So it is very important for us to begin to break this vicious cycle and do some things that show the worth of government to people like that, and it's a way to get people better to support government.
But Barney, two illustrations of where you have done that, however imperfect they might have been, would be the stimulus package during the depths of what really was the worst crisis since the Depression, and the Affordable Health Care Act, which probably, I think one could demonstrate, disproportionately helps the kind of people you're talking about. They're more likely not to have insurance or have bad insurance or have people, have family members with disabilities. And yet, those are the people who sometimes have been the most vocally opposed. And
I agree. I think health care is a...
So why?
Stimulus is a tough one to explain. I think with health care, it's this. And it's, I think, a similar problem hit Bill Clinton's and Hillary Clinton's health care plan as Obama's, with all their differences. The perception was, it is true there were some people who didn't have health care, but a majority of people did have some health care. And this is, in fact, the case. The purpose in both bills was to extend health care to people who didn't have it without having a lot of additional money to put in the system. And so the perception was that what these bills did was to take money from people who were already getting health care and recycle it to poor people. That was greatly exaggerated, but the people were in the mood to believe the worst. If someone had said to Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, here is $70 billion, let's say, suppose somebody said, let's not invade Iraq anymore. And let's not do similarly damaging things. And let's begin to save substantial tens of billions of dollars a year by not having an overextended military that does much more than makes any sense. And you can put that into healthcare. It would have been an easier sell. You could have said to people, look, we're going to help you a little bit. The stimulus is more frustrating. The only thing I can say about that is this, people got confused. The stimulus, by the way, you know it was not called the stimulus. And I love my Democratic leadership, and I think Nancy Pelosi has been a great leader. But she and others, they're a little bit too addicted to these focus groups, in my judgment. Now, focus groups are you take people who are not engaged in an issue and you sample their opinion. The problem is that I think there's a high correlation between people who are not engaged in an issue and eligible for focus groups and airheads. Because who doesn't know anything?
They have conversations with the dining room table.
Yes. And they decided that we should not call the stimulus, we should call it the recovery program. I've said before, that is counterintuitive to me. I have found people generally would tell you they would rather be stimulated than recover. So I don't know why that happened. But the problem with that was it got mixed up with the TARP. The stimulus program came in the midst of the effort to dig out from under this terrible financial crisis caused by deregulation. If you have any question about that, read the appendices. But the point is that people were so angry that people got confused, the TARP and the stimulus. Had we been able to do the stimulus on its own in a climate in which there was not all this anger about bailing out the banks, then I think it would have been more popular and we could have gotten a bigger one.
You were central to that, to TARP and everything else that was done in 2008, 2009. Did we come close to going over the cliff?
Apparently, and I take the word of Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, two Bush appointees for whom I have a great deal of respect.
And who you work with very closely.
And Bernanke, of course, it's ironic, not ironic, but it's a sign of the dysfunctionality, frankly, of much of the Republican Party, that this conservative man who was 3 times appointed to office by George Bush to the Council of Economic Advisors, to be a Fed governor and then the chairman of the Fed, became this symbol of liberal excess to the Republicans. He was trying to help stave off or get us out of a terrible depression. They came to us in September and they said, we are about to melt down after Lehman Brothers. And people have said, this could have been as bad as the Great Depression. In some ways, it could have been worse for this reason. 80 years ago in the Great Depression, 85 years ago, you still had geographic separation. Things could be terrible here, but they weren't necessarily so bad over there. But by 2008, we were one linked grid. A failure of lending here brings down a bank in Northern Ireland. And they were afraid, as a result of Lehman, what it meant was there would have been a very substantial drop in economic activity because nobody would lend to anybody. By the way, one of the things that I've had to deal with people on the left who say, yeah, but what you did was you gave money to the banks. What did the little guy get out of that? Well, what the little guy got out of that was the staving off of a collapse. And I want to point out to people, if we'd had the kind of collapse that could have happened, Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon would have been fine. They would not have had to sell their apartments. It was the person living at the margin who would have been squeezed more. But they were convinced that we would have had a very, very serious drop in, a drop in economic activity of 50% or more. And we had no way to doubt them or reason to doubt them because that wasn't a risk you wanted to take.
And the government got its money back with TARP, too.
The government made money on the TARP. But by the way, here's an example of the perception problem. And this is the problem with the surplus got linked in, the stimulus, as one of those bailouts. If you ask people now, one of the problems you have is, you Democrats, all you want to do is do bailouts. The Democrats give bailouts. There were 5 bailouts around that period. Lehman, AIG, Bear Stearns, the automobiles, Fannie and Freddie, and the TARP. 5 cases of money being given to help private entities stay alive. Every single one was initiated by George W. Bush. 2 of them, Bear Stearns and AIG, he started and finished by himself, no congressional involvement. The other 3, he started them, we carried them out because we thought we were good. In the case of the autos, we did expand it. And yeah, the only one of those that we haven't made all the money back is the one that I would think people here would be most supportive of, that was the autos. We saved the American automobile industry. Important to remember that Ford, which had gotten its cash built up, Ford had cashed out some stuff, so they had a cash reserve. General Motors and Chrysler were facing bankruptcy. Well, had it before. Ford was not, but Ford was just as eager as General Motors and Chrysler for that to happen because they said if they go under, there is no way you can do business and make manufacture cars in America with only one company at the end of the supply chain.
Do you feel confident now about the stability of the financial institutions, and do you and your view, which you do address in the book, of Elizabeth Warren's contention that they're still too big, and even though the risk of too big to fail is not what it was 8 years ago, that she still worries that we have too much concentration.
Let me sort this out. First of all, I want to say about Elizabeth Warren, who I am very proud that she's one of the blurbers on the book.
Elizabeth Warren and Hank Paulson, back to back, blurbers in the back. I don't think there's any other book that would have those two. I'm not sure anything else they agree on, Barney.
No, back to back. Maybe in the next book we'll get them belly to belly. But I'd say Elizabeth herself strongly lobbied for that bill. In fact, Senator Russell Feingold then was the only Democrat who said he wasn't voting for it because while he said it made it better in every area it touched, it didn't make it good enough, and he had very high standards. And Elizabeth lobbied him very hard. So she's always been clear. She was glad the bill was passed, and it's an improvement. She is for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, but specifically says Glass-Steagall's repeal, which I voted against, didn't cause this crisis. She does believe they are too big, but not too big to fail, and that's a distinction. Too big to fail meant that if an institution got indebted beyond the point where it could pay its debts, it was bailed out and kept in business. It did not fail. We now have a situation where they are too big for us to ignore their failure. But if a large institution today can't pay its debts, it is taken over by the federal government and dissolved. We do then step in and pay some of the debts to avoid this kind of spiral. But every penny paid out, the Treasury Secretary has to recover from large financial institutions. And the argument is, oh, your system is a great wet kiss to the institutions. Conclusive proof to the contrary. The bill, by its terms, makes certain institutions automatically covered by that. The phrase is a systemically important financial institution, a SIFI. But it left discretion with the regulators to designate others that weren't banks but were big enough. Every entity that they have considered for designation has resisted bitterly. MetLife is going to court to sue. You can't say I'm systemically important because, in fact, it is a tough regulatory situation. As to what I think, we have made it much, much less likely that there will be another crisis until there is another evolution in the financial system. That is, I think we have done a pretty good job of stopping the practices that led to the last crisis.
I'm going to invite you all to come up and start asking questions. We have 2 microphones, and if you would just come to one of the ones closest to you, and we'll open it up to everybody. While they're coming up here, Barney, you suggested earlier, did you, that House of Cards doesn't capture the real House of Representatives?
I'm a great believer in the First Amendment, but if I wasn't, I would wipe that show off. Here's the problem. It is so not only wrong, but reinforces all of these inaccurate negative assessments. And I will tell you a true story. A good friend of mine was an ambassador to a country whose president does not behave very well towards his opposition and is kind of corrupt. And on instructions, the ambassador asked him to clean up his act. And the answer was, don't lecture me. I know what goes on. I watch House of Cards.
Let's start over here.
You mentioned guns, and I wanted to ask your thoughts about gun control. Do we have any chance of ever getting it, especially since Democrats seem to think it?
On gun control, I'm afraid that it's very unlikely for a couple of reasons. First of all, the people who are interested in keeping unrestricted use of their guns care more about that than anything else. And there are more of them who care only about that than people who care only about restricting them. And there's just this political problem. It is a matter of intensity. And the National Rifle Association is an excellent lobbying organization in technique. And they don't have, by the way, this is one of my arguments to my friends on the left. You've never seen a NRA demonstration. They don't have march-ins and shoot-ins. What they have is the disciplined approach to politics. They have everybody in the NRA told to register to vote and know who your legislators are and write to them. And I do not foresee us having enough energy of people who make that their primary issue, gun regulation. I wish it were the case, but I don't see it.
Over here.
My former colleague, David Wu. Hello, David.
Hello, Barney. It's good to have you in this town again. Oh, about House of Cards, the Chinese government encourages people to watch it, by the way.
I'm not surprised.
I'm sorry, David, the Chinese government what?
Encourages the population.
Do they really?
Watch it.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
That's very interesting and not surprising.
Barney, in all your years of public service, what was the most difficult vote that you took? And please explain why, what made it really hard?
Well, I'll tell you the one that I think was the big mistake, and that was voting against George H.W. Bush's going into Kuwait to throw at Iraq. The decision to go into Iraq and take it over was a terrible mistake. But I voted against the first President Bush because I thought he was going to act like the second one. And I think that was a different situation. You had a stable country, Kuwait, not my favorite, but the fact is that they did not deserve to be brutally invaded by Saddam Hussein. And we had a very legitimate, achievable purpose. Use our force to expel a bad guy from another country and then get out of there and not try to reconstruct the country. So that was the one that I think was mistaken.
I'm a college student in the Washington, D.C. area, and my question is, what do you think is especially important for young people today to understand about government and public service, and why?
That's a very important question. Namely, that the political system is more open to change from engaged citizens than people think. We have two kinds of voter suppression going on in America today. We have the terrible, legally enforced voter suppression that Republicans use against African Americans. Do you want to understand that? I remember when they put on one of these things where you had to come up with a birth certificate or something. One of my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus said, my mother doesn't have a birth certificate. She was born in Mississippi in 1922. They didn't give black people birth certificates back then. So that's terrible. But there's another form of voter suppression from people on the left who tell people that it's kind of a house of cards analogy. Oh, only big money counts. These politicians don't care. If you tell people that their votes aren't counted, some of them don't vote. The fact is that if enough people vote, we can win. Best example, net neutrality. All of the big guns with money in American politics were against net neutrality. But everybody with a computer basically worried that their right to steal other people's intellectual property would be a risk, it seems to me. And they rallied to defend it. And another one was financial reform. We could not have passed the bill we passed with the restrictions on various financial practices if there hadn't been a crisis. And it was best summed up by Elizabeth Warren the day the committee passed the Independent Consumer Bureau. He said, you know, they told me not even to try this because the banks always win. But they didn't win today. So I just wish people would understand that registering to vote and following who's who and voting against bad people would be important. I was debating someone from Occupy, and I said, I was disappointed. I never saw a voter registration table at an Occupy site. Well, she said, that's not what we're into. Well, unfortunately, it was what the Tea Party was into. So the message I would give young people is the notion that politicians never listen to you is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if people would register and vote, they would do a lot better in achieving their goals.
Hi, Barney. I know that you were voted by your colleagues as both the most partisan and the most bipartisan member of Congress. And when I worked for you, I know that you used to cut deals with people of all political persuasions. And I'm just wondering if you think that is now impossible. I remember when you retired, you sounded like you had run out of people to deal with.
No, I thank you.
And Barney, give your defensive earmarks in that answer.
Yes, I will. Here's the deal. That is, I've said, I am still a member of a minority that is greatly disrespected. I'm a partisan Democrat, and I support that. You do not have coherent self-government without political parties. Otherwise, it's all personality. So parties are important. Excessive partisanship is the problem. And I was very proud, yes, they asked each party to vote for members of the other party, who was the most partisan and who was the most bipartisan. I was in the top 5 of both, which means that I fight very hard for what I think, but when it gets down to a point where you're going to calculate, I'm very good at figuring out, okay, what's the best way to work it out? And some of the things I did were very partisan, and it varies with issues. Some issues are partisan issues. Some issues can be bipartisan, and you cooperate. And yeah, of course you make deals. You have 435 independent members of the House, 100 members of the Senate. And if people do not give in, nothing happens. If you have 435 purists, you are bogged down. My own view is this with regard to compromise. It is rarely justified to agree to make something worse. But making something only partly better is almost always the right thing to do. And there is this one view that I think terribly flawed. I've never seen it work. Oh no, let's not accept that improvement in the situation. Let's let things get worse, and pressure will build to do more. That's not only morally questionable if what's getting worse hurts people. I have never seen it work. And earmarks, Al says, but there are a couple of defenses of earmarks. One, by the way, is in democratic theory. Earmarks, for me, were a chance to have the people I represented differ with the bureaucracy. Now, I don't use bureaucracy as a bad term. Public officials are very important. But there is a tendency for them to let expertise go too far in matters which shouldn't be governed by expertise, where local preference would take effect. So when it came to where should the road go? How many lanes should there be? Yeah, I thought the people who lived near that highway had the right to make that statement. So I did work, and it also was the case that earmarks helped in this regard. Everybody here believes that there are times when a politician, a member of Congress, should vote for something that is unpopular in the greater good. And telling other people to take risks of their career is very easy and very morally satisfying, but it's not always going to work. What earmarks do is to give you the ability to go to people who you are asking to do something unpopular and give them a little support for it. It's that kind of trade-off. And the earmarks are not bad. They are allowing democratic input. So yeah, when I was chairman of the committee, members had a particular thing they wanted. If it wasn't a bad thing, I would try to do it. And people should understand, legislating is peculiar. 435 individual people, 100 individuals there. Nobody can give anybody else an order. We're not allowed to use money as an exchange. Somehow these strong-willed people have to come to agreement on some of the most important topics and the most emotionally committed topics. And you simply can't do that without some of these tools that make it work.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Barney, I want to disrespectfully disagree with you about the importance of money in Congress and the weight of money versus the weight of people. And it is the case, if every American voted, they may be able to withstand the effect of money. But without that happening, I see every single day the importance of educated money going in and feeling itself heard. The insurance company, and despite what you think, Dodd-Frank left the banks with immense amounts of power in Congress and with the president. And I'm wondering what you think might be possible to do to give the people the same kind of weight that money has.
The only way to do that is for people to vote, and for you not to tell them that their voting is always going to lose, because that's wrong. I did not. You say you disagree with me that I said money doesn't have a lot of power. No, I said it does have power. Most of the time it has more power than it should. Although my concern with money, by the way, is less that it influences how people vote than it influences who they are. The worst part of money is in the electoral process and the advantage it gives. Much of the time they don't need to go to them. As far as the financial reform bill, I think it was a substantial diminution in the likelihood that we will have a crisis. The Independent Consumer Bureau, I believe, is very strong. Yes, banks are still powerful. Any large collection of industries in America will be powerful. My point was this: the norm is for the interests to be dominant. But on those cases where the public can be mobilized, net neutrality, financial reform, some other issues, the financial industries the large interests will be beaten back. And I don't want people discouraged from doing that. You ask me, how can we empower people? The only way to do it is for them to take advantage of what they have. The NRA is not a big contributor to my colleagues. The NRA does not represent, on the whole, very rich people. The NRA is tremendously influential because it successfully mobilizes its share of the population. So if other people who cared about issues were to be as successful as the NRA, there would be a great increase in popular influence.
Mr. Frank, I met you back in 1986 at what was reported to be the first college-based AIDS education forum at Virginia Tech. Back in 1886, did you have any clue that it would mushroom into such a huge issue?
Stand back a second. Get back up from the mic. I physically couldn't understand you. I'm sorry. Say it again.
I met you back in 1986, and you attended college forum down
At Blacksburg.
In Blacksburg, yes. And it was not well attended, but it was the first college education forum for AIDS. And I was wondering if you, even back then, had an idea that it would balloon into the crisis that it became.
I had no greater insight than most lay people, although by 86 it was already pretty bad. I mean, by 86 it was clear that it was an epidemic. So yeah, and our efforts were beginning around that time, and we saw bad stuff coming. And the other point too is, at some point it wasn't an operational question how bad it was going to get. It was going to get bad enough to act, and that's all you needed to know.
Hi, as a lifelong Democrat and a member of the Democratic Party in Fairfax County, I would like your reaction to the fact that blue states elect Republicans. A red state would never elect a Democrat. It happens in governor's races and other races. It broke my heart when Ted Kennedy's seat went Republican. What can we do about that? It really...
What we can do is organize a vote. By the way, I would disagree. There are red states. Now, we lost some last time, but one of the reasons for the switch in the Senate was we lost Alaska, which we had held. We had the Dakotas. So yes, some of the red states.
Maryland, the last three governors.
All right, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you asked me a question that had an actual premise. Red states sometimes elect blue people and vice versa. There have been Democrats elected from, for instance, the Dakotas. At one point, we had 4 Democratic senators from the Dakotas. But at any rate, the answer is there's no mechanical answer to that. The answer is for people to get out and vote. I will say this, and maybe this is the factor, and maybe the Tea Party is helping us. People on the left can be a little less perfectionist and vote for the better candidate, and particularly if you are in a red state, do not impose on the Democratic candidate unrealistic demands that will make an election even harder.
Well, the Republicans get very unrealistic demands, but I think it's because Democrats don't understand the power of the majority. They say...
Well, the only way to deal with that, ma'am, is to tell them that. There's no mechanical answer to that. The only way to do it is to argue with them.
Can I just add on to your question for a second? Barney, back in the 70s and 80s, the normal state of American politics was the Democrats controlled the Congress and many state governments, and Republicans seemed to control the White House. It looks like we've almost done a 180.
Yeah.
There are people who think that Democrats aren't going to control the House for as far as we can see.
Well, part of that's redistricting. Well, first of all, here's part of it. The major shift in American politics over the last 40 years was the fact that the overwhelming majority of members of Congress in 1970 from the 11 states of the old Confederacy plus Oklahoma and Kentucky were Democrats. They weren't Democrats who voted the way other Democrats did. There are very few white Democrats from the South. There's Steve Cohn in Tennessee. There's some from the part of Florida that's geographically southern but not politically. There's a couple in North Carolina, and that's about it. You don't have white Democrats from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas. And so that's what happened. And that's why the Republicans have this great advantage, cemented recently by redistricting. But on the other hand, the Senate goes back and forth. The Senate was Democratic by a good margin. A couple of, we may not get it back next time, you know, a couple of heartbreakers to me, like Kay Hagan and one or two others. But the Democrats will clearly pick up Senate seats in the next time. The House, the gerrymandering had a major part of it.
Sir, over there.
Is this the right distance? All right. Just first off, I want to say, 22-year resident of Brookline, Massachusetts. So it was very fun. I'm sorry you took off. Second question was, as I guess a gay intellectual liberal, you sort of represented everything the right came to hate. You became a bit of a lightning rod. To what extent did you find that almost sort of liberating, or the fact that you could count on sort of, you know, left liberal support, and you could say almost anything they would say, oh, it's Barney Frank?
No, in fact, I took that as an obligation, frankly, to argue with some of my friends about strategy and tactics. One of the things I say in the book is people in my former line of work give themselves too much credit for standing up to their enemies. Standing up to your enemies is easy. It's often a good way to raise money. Standing up to your friends when you think they are wrong is what's hard. You don't want to do it in a harsh way, but I spent a lot of time arguing strategy and tactics with many of my friends, and I thought that was part of my obligation. On the other hand, there was something to it. Both while I was in the legislature, later when I got to Congress, it seemed to me that given who I was and where I was, unlike many of my colleagues in the House, I was never going to go beyond being a representative. I didn't think about being a senator until the very, very end, or the president. And I thought I was in a situation where I had enough support so I would probably not lose, but not enough appeal so I could go somewhere else. And that was the ideal situation, because I did not have to worry about electoral considerations or fundraising. And it was the sweet spot in terms of being able to focus on what I did.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Well, all right, let's see, I'll go quickly. Go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank you for all you've done for this country.
Thank you. Thank you.
So in addition to all that's been discussed tonight, you've been quite the trailblazer for your religious and spiritual beliefs as well. I was wondering if you could talk about your beliefs as well as how that's affected your views and the policy that you were able to initiate.
Well, I am not a religious man. I have no, and I'll tell you, it's not, I have a great deal of intellectual curiosity about things where I think I can get more information. I don't have a lot of intellectual curiosity about things that I think I can never know the answer to. And I put religion and that category there. On the other hand, it is clear to me that growing up in a Jewish household with Jewish values, that much of that infused my view about the need to go on, to cure the world. It's clear that that was part of what I learned. I do believe that, you know, that logically people should make their choices without those kind of influences, but they were clearly there, and it just it never occurred to me that it wasn't your obligation to try and help people who are less fortunate.
We're going to try to squeeze everyone in, if you don't mind, Liz, because we just ended. But quickly.
Okay. This might be a bit of a false dichotomy, but do you feel in the last 25 years that the LGBT movement has gotten too far away from the HIV issue, at least domestically? And do you think that...
No, not at all. In the first place, there were a lot of other issues. I think gay people as a whole pay more attention to HIV than almost any other group. But it's also the case that there are a lot of other groups that suffer from the HIV, and I don't understand why gay people are obligated to be the only ones who do anything about it. There's another agenda. There are additional items on the agenda. I think if you look at it, that, as I said, gay organizations are as supportive of HIV activity as any other, and I think it's been very appropriate.
Sir.
Quickly.
Was there anything about the process of writing this book that you found to be either very rewarding or very challenging?
Yeah, challenging. Sitting there, and I mean, I'd rather read than write. It's a kind of a discipline. I did kind of get into it. I started out dictating, and that didn't work very well. It was just a shambles, and scared my poor editor half to death when he read it. But I did sit down and work on the computer with a lot of help from Jeff, who asked, from my husband Jim. I'm kind of clumsy. I've been in a lifelong war with inanimate objects, and I was hitting all kinds of keys that made the computer stop. And Jim was in a drugstore one day and saw this much bigger yellow computer, plastic, with much bigger letters, and he got me that. And that worked pretty well, because I didn't hit the wrong things, except for one, the Alt key next to the spacebar. I have no idea what it's supposed to do. I do know that if you hit it the way I did, it froze your computer. And so Jim pried it off the keyboard, and it worked very well. Yes.
We have two more. One.
Thank you very much. I've been baffled by how the Republicans have handled Obama and the response and all the, I think, really great stuff he's tried to do. What's your take on the reaction of the Republicans to Obama?
Well, I think it's that one I have, I think, figured out. When a Republican president is in power, Democrats have a partisan instinct not to cooperate, but our belief in government, our view that an effective government is important for the values we care about, the people we care about, makes us cooperate. As the Republicans have become more and more dominated by people who do not believe government has a positive role, to a shocking degree, but it's there, they have a double incentive not to cooperate. They don't want the president to prosper politically. Well, we don't want the Republican president to prosper politically. But we separate the president from the government. In their case, the two come together, reinforce each other. They don't like the president, and they don't like the government even more than they don't like the president. So they have no reason whatsoever to want to be cooperative.
Final question.
Thank you. I kind of wanted to just come up here and thank you and give a personal experience that hopefully will mean something to other people to get out there and reach out and talk to their congressman. I worked for you and volunteered for you back in 1980 when I thought I was into politics. And I was so happy that you got into the U.S. Congress. And politics kind of went away from my life, and I wasn't very active. And then back in the financial crisis or whatever, I called up your office and I said, I'm no longer in your district, but I need some help. And you called me personally, and I was just floored. And I just wanted to bring that out, that people should, reach out and, yeah. So
Well, I'm going to say this. Members of elected officials are much more interested in hearing from their constituents than people realize. There is an unused quantum of influence that people have. You're not going to win all the time in every issue, but very few politicians feel that they can ignore their voters. If you don't vote, they don't pay any attention. But people who are registered and who call them up, it's not going to solve everything overnight. But as I said, it has a much greater potential for changing things than people realize. Thank you.
That was a wonderful anecdote. I interviewed Barney about 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and it was one morning he was very tired. And I said, why are you so tired? He said, Pelosi has us out fundraising every weekend. He said, I got to go to Seattle one weekend, Denver the next, Minneapolis, every weekend. He said, I do 2 groups. He said, I do bankers, I do gays. And then he looked at me and he said, there's a 10% overlap. You have been wonderful. You've been a terrific audience. Thank you for your good questions. Thank you for your attentiveness, and I really appreciate it. And let's give a final, maybe even standing round of applause to one of the most remarkable public officials of all time, Barney Frank.